Hi, everyone. All right. Where do we have everyone starting? Not even starting. Where do we have everyone joining us from? Drop it in the chat and let us know. I'm in California, so it feels a little early. Iowa. Molly, I always forget you're in Iowa. You feel like a California. Dana, where are you at?
I live in the state of Maine, where it's nice and chilly today. We're expecting a foot of snow.
Oh, lovely. Wow. We are completely across the country. We have you in Maine, Molly in Iowa, and me in California. This is wonderful, covering all of the zones of the country. All right, we have Jackie from Canada. Awesome. All right, well, let's get started. Should we give people a couple more minutes to come in? Let's give them a couple more minutes. While everybody is trickling in, wanted to just give a couple housekeeping things. Please drop in any questions you have in the chat. All right. Can everybody see me?
I think you need to turn your camera on, Elise.
It says my camera is on. I need to turn it off.
All right. Well, we see a wonderful picture of you.
Oh, let's try that again. How about now?
No.
Okay. All right, Rev Genius team, anything you guys can do here?
There we go.
There we go. You're
Awesome.
here.
Perfect. Let's start over. Perfect. Okay, great. All right. So talking about revenue ops to the rescue. Before we even dive in, kind of want to give a quick intro. I think everybody knows me already. I'm Elise from Syncre, Senior Director of Community as well as Corp Comms here. And then Molly, tell us about you and where you're at today.
Yeah, absolutely. So Molly Bodensteiner, I support revenue operations at Deal with a keen focus on really process and systems. I've been in the revenue operations space, I like to say, before it was cool. Really, majority of my career has been spent in operations in some way, shape, or form over the last 12 years. So excited to be here today and talk about RevOps to the rescue.
Love it. And Dana, tell us about yourself.
Sure. I work for Anaplan. At Anaplan, I lead a CRO and revenue operations advisory practice. So I work with our largest clients and customers to help them understand what some of the trends are in connected planning and sales operations, revenue operations. And I work with our account executives and executives on some of the largest opportunities that we have. And I've been a fairly vocal person around revenue operations since 2016. I spent most of my career in sales ops, but I was a analyst at Serious Decisions in Forrester, where I started to track the trend. Back in 2016, there were 400 people that considered themselves to be in revenue operations when I started pulling those stats out of LinkedIn. And today it's tens of thousands, which it's been pretty cool to be along this ride and watch it happen and to push it in this direction wherever I could.
I love that. And in that same vein, right, we did a poll a couple months ago, more recently rather, and what we found is essentially that data scientist is always going to be a really sexy job, right? But we also know that according to LinkedIn, RevOps roles are skyrocketing in 2023, no doubt, right? And it's interesting because it's becoming more of a need than ever. And we also have found that everyone is collecting data more than they can collect. But essentially, what do they do with it, right? How do they move it? How do they calculate? How do they standardize it in such a way that makes it work for them and provides them insights so that they can make it actionable in their day-to-day go-to-market function that makes essentially an impact on the revenue and growth. And so as we think about this, we really talked to 290 folks and we thought, with this growing field of RevOps, who owns the data? And Molly, we've been talking about this for a long time, and I will dive into that in a little bit. Who owns the data? What do you do with it? How do you create essentially more growth around it? And what are the processes that need to happen? And who are the people that you need in place? And so we went through our findings and we found that, well, guess what? This is no news to anyone, but if this is the first time you're hearing it, guess what? Customer data without RevOps is essentially disorganized and disparate, and it's owned by multiple departments, right? So what does that mean? You talk to any org, no matter the size, small or medium, large, mid, and you might, if it's a small company, they might say, I have a one-band shop and I own everything, right? If you talk to a medium-sized to larger enterprise, you might have a couple of functions that own the data or the systems, right? And then what's happening and what we're finding is that there isn't a cookie cutter formula for any of these companies, actually. In fact, everyone is likely trying still to figure it out. And so what it's causing is that we're finding is that trust and data accuracy, in fact, when we asked our respondents, is that 20% is actually higher in orgs with RevOps. And Molly and Dana, we'll dive into what your thoughts are and what you're seeing if that is the case. And then lastly, we also found that trust and data matching is 20% higher in orgs with RevOps, but only amongst executives. So Dana, I love your thoughts on that, while ops pros disagree. So those were the couple findings that we found, right? And what I want to do is I want to go to Molly for this one, is essentially when you think about customer data without RevOps, because you do this on the daily, and thinking about how it is as disparate and disorganized as we've been talking about for years, from your perspective as a RevOps leader, what do you think is causing all of this? I'm just going to throw that at you.
Yeah, so I think when we talk about, disparate data and lack of trust in the data from organizations that have a revenue operations and those that don't, I think, I'm going to say like an obvious answer, right? It comes down to alignment. So when you have an organization of, revenue operations structured in the sense that you've got marketing, sales, CS, finance, product ops, sitting under one organization, like logically, you should have better aligned data because you're ultimately reducing a silo and building and fostering that alignment. And whether that's a reporting structure or a way that you operate too, because I'm a big believer of like, you can have revenue operations as a practice that doesn't have to be a team structure, right? It's more of a mindset of how you're working cross-functionally around the customer experience. But that's where I think you see higher trust and higher alignment in that data because you're ultimately knocking down some of those silos and making sure you're looking at the experience holistically across the customer versus just your specific vertical and ensuring those handoffs and processes are aligned, right? Data is ultimately an output of process. And so I think we've got to remember that when we talk about data. It's not that you just magically generate this data. It's a byproduct of somebody doing something, whether that's a customer, whether that's a salesperson, whether that's marketing, that's generating that data. And that comes from process.
Let's talk about that a little bit. So quick tips on how do we get to that alignment? So you're saying process will help us get there. Is that correct?
Yeah. So when you think about it, right, people, process, data, technology is generally, the things you think about is that your process is ultimately what drives the generation of the data that you're looking to capture. And your technology is then going and supporting that process and that data capture. And so without having clear process, right, you're going to have inconsistent data. So if, good example of this is let's just think about, a demo call, right? So you think about you have AEs running demo calls. If AEs are not all capturing that information in a standard way based on process, you then are going to have disparate data that you're capturing 12 different ways in spreadsheets in somebody's head, in their email, in Salesforce, in Slack, wherever they're storing it. And then you have, non-aggregatable or more challenging to aggregate data, right? But versus defining the process, and this is more of like a technical process of, you log your demo notes here, here's the values we need to capture. These are what these definitions mean. You then have a standardized output from the data perspective.
Yeah, I feel like we can go on about this for a long time because beyond that process too, how do you think about getting the stakeholders involved? And Dana, I'm going to punt this one over to you. Is what we found in our research is that without RevOps, orgs can't seem to agree on who should own the data, the reporting, the analytics, and 1 in 5 respondents said that they'd place it in the hands of the executives. What are
Well,
your
the
initial
observation
thoughts?
about can you guys hear me okay? Yeah,
Mhm.
the observation about data being more accurate in companies that have revenue operations, I think that has something to do with the fact also that smaller, more nimble companies have a tendency to gravitate towards revenue operations as an operating model initially. So any company that was founded in the last 20 years, certainly within the last 5 years, started with a revenue operations operating model because part of it was just affordability because they hired that one person who had the ability to gather all this information, to collect it, to put together the resources so that they were able to tell the stories that the executives needed to understand in order to make decisions about the business. That's one big factor. When you look at some of these larger corporations, the ones that have been around for 50, 100 years with these large silos between sales and marketing and customer success, they're adopting revenue operations models as laggards but in name only. And Molly, I like what you said, where it doesn't have to be an organizational structure. It could be what Kerry Cunningham and I coined a long time ago was a coalition of the willing. So people just initially starting to work together to tell the story. Um, but who owns the data? I mean, it's in a bigger corporations is asking the question, who owns the air? Because there's so much data in all these different places. And I don't think that you have to wait in order for the source data to be correct before you're able to tell some of the stories that need to be told. So to accelerate this process, start with the stories that you're trying to tell. And I did this from experience where I had that coalition of the willing. I had a revenue operations team reporting into me, but when we started to look at marketing, at customer success, it's what was sales operations. I think there were 38 people inside of the organization that were responsible for data, and they weren't all working together. They weren't collaborating. They were doing things sometimes in conflict with one another. And we kicked off this data accuracy initiative by looking to tell a story that was common across all these different groups. So it was from sales to marketing to customer success and to finance. And once we did that, the data started to fix itself because we understood the story that we were trying to tell. They went back to figure out what information they needed and how to gather it, and then they went back and they fixed it at the source.
Yeah, that's really important. We also have a comment from Landon Sutton on LinkedIn saying standardizing the note taking process helps execution as well. Mom, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I feel like that was, in addition to kind of my comment on the demo pieces, as you gather that information, it will help you deliver better results from an executionary standpoint too. So,
Yeah, very interesting. Dana and Molly, feel free to take a stab at this one. Molly and I have talked about the alignment pieces and how it also causes silos. And we also talked about sometimes perhaps a CRO might own the data, right? But they're not quite sure what they're looking for or how or what they need from the top down. How do you advise perhaps CROs or revenue leaders and where should they start? And maybe it's back to what you said is start with your KPIs or what it is that you need. But with that, talk to us about what that looks like.
I think maybe 10 years ago, I was sitting in a boardroom in Boston somewhere, and it was one of these vendors had put together people of sales operations analytics, and we were just sitting around having a conversation. And there was someone sitting at the table. He'd only been doing this for 3 or 4 years, was fairly new, fairly junior. And he struck upon something I thought was brilliant. I actually turned it into research at Serious Decisions when I was there. He said there's really only 3 types of data or types of stories that we're trying to tell inside of sales and revenue operations. He said that the first one is operational. So we're trying to tell the story of how the business is performing against its objectives and how it's performing over time. So things like year-over-year trends and quarter-over-quarter, and whether or not certain certain trajectories are heading in the right slope. For instance, like pipeline creation. So I thought that was brilliant, because if you can solve that problem, if you can provide people the information so that they understand from lead all the way through renewal how they're performing against their in-year objectives, that's a pretty big chunk of it. The second one was diagnostic. And those are the questions that we ask when things aren't going well, or when there's something that looks curious to us. Like, hey, why are some reps performing better than others? Or why is this product doing well in EMEA, but it's not doing well in the US? And I think if you try to turn that into an operational report, you're going to destroy all of your operational reports, because there's endless amounts of questions that need to be answered. And you can muddy up all those operational reports with those one-off types of requests. And then the last one is what we call interpretive, which is, highly cognitive. It takes a lot of time and preparation and data gathering, things like annual planning, go-to-market structuring, reorganizing your sales organization. So I thought that was brilliant: operational, diagnostic, and interpretive. And then the other thing that I noticed is that when companies were buying a BI tool, trying to solve all three of those problems, they often ended up scrapping it, because you can't solve diagnostic questions in a BI tool. You can't solve interpretive problems in a BI tool. You need a planning tool like Anaplan in order to do the planning, and you need an operational tool like any kind of a BI tool that you could imagine in order to feed those operational reports. But then you need an underlying layer like Syncari that's going to gather the information from all these different sources so that you can feed it. So biggest piece of advice I have, and the one that I followed, is break it down into those three different structures. Solve the operational reporting issues first by audience. So a salesperson needs to see something different than a sales manager versus an executive. And then get a really smart MBA that's going to focus on the diagnostic piece of it if you're big enough, and then have that person just go out there and do the research. And then they can feed the interpretive planning questions as they find solutions. So long answer, but a simple solution.
And I think the one thing that's super important too, to piggyback on that, and I love how you broke those into the three kind of categories, right? And start with the operational as the first piece, is like, also make sure you've got the alignment on the definitions of what you're looking at. So while you're going to have different slices across the teams, if you're doing apples and oranges, right? If sales is calling, let's just use customer as the example, one thing, and marketing's calling customer another thing, and those aren't aligned, you don't have that foundation.
Such a good point. And so many companies too, Molly, like, what's a region? Like, somebody calls a region versus an area versus a theater versus a territory.
Yeah.
You really have to you have to settle on common terminology at the very onset. And I can't tell you how many years in my career I've spent arguing with marketing about an MQL versus an SAL. And so get that out of the way.
Words matter, right? And I think that is so critical, especially as you're looking at data and you're trying to interpret data, because when you make assumptions in this, you can have $1 million impacts on what you're interpreting.
Yeah,
I think a lot of companies have gone, it's a simple trick, but number your sales stages. Yep. So that when you're talking about a sales stage 4, everybody knows what a sales stage 4 is, and you're not having to speak those solutions in development every single time. And suddenly everybody in the company knows what a stage 4 is. It's tiny little things like that matter.
Socializing like the data dictionary, right? Making sure that your glossary sits right in within your BI tool, sits directly there. Tips and tricks in like CRM is making sure like you've got the help text right on top of it for anything that could be misinterpreted.
Yes.
Little things help keep everyone aligned, but the data dictionary, the data glossary, having that really clearly defined. And I've even in WBR decks or QBR decks like made sure before we start talking about the metrics, like what we're talking about is right there in the glossary in the deck, so everyone's aligned before we start having the conversation too.
Yeah,
that's very smart. Dana, just so I can capture it, you said there were 3 kinds of data, right? Operational, and then what was the second one?
Diagnostic,
and
interpretive. So
this
operational, just have that one conversation about from the CMO to the CSO to the finance leader. What information do you need to see on a daily basis? And it's a good report because the day that you don't produce it or the day it doesn't get updated, everyone's calling asking where it is.
Yep. They know
So
when the pipeline breaks, stuff feeds it, right?
right.
Interesting. What do you both think, right, across the operational diagnostic interpretive data? What do you think that a lot of us or many orgs are missing the mark, or at least not capturing today? What are we doing too much of and not enough of?
I think we boil the ocean a lot. I mean, Dana, I love your perspective, right? But I think we try to get everything, right? And by trying to get everything, we end up getting nothing. And I think that's a lot of our challenge. Like when you look at the operational, right? What's the key performance metrics that we need, right? Likely somewhere between, I want to say 5 and 7. It's probably most companies are probably going to shoot around 10, but like get those right, because that becomes your baseline of like what you're layering on top of. And so when you're looking at that, that's what's telling you, where's my performance, how am I pacing, what am I trending, and like that then allows you, if you have those right, that then allows you to ask those diagnostic questions and being able to do the comparisons and understanding, what would happen if we did X, Y, or Z? Why is this happening? Answering kind of those secondary questions. But I think we all jump to the secondary or the tertiary before we actually have the primary in place. And Dana, I'd love your thoughts on that.
I agree with everything that you just said. And sometimes jumping to the tertiary is a defense mechanism from the executives. Like they don't want to talk about the operational reports. They want to divert and have a conversation about something else that's not going to help them realize
what happens if we change quotas by 20%. Well, we don't even know where what our performance is today and how that's pacing, right? Like let's actually look year over year and see, like it might not be as bad as we think it is, or it could be horrible, but we don't have it defined and we're not talking about like the run the business metrics.
Yeah. I think it's not just the failing of revenue operations. There are a lot of people who contributed to this failing, but if you look at what's going on inside of high tech today, where we've got these massive layoffs that are occurring across every single company, it's contagion. How much of it's real versus how much of it's just copying. But I remember working for a company that absolutely caught on fire during COVID, and just the nature of the solution that they were selling, it increased the demand by X-fold because of it. But I had assembled a team of analytics people together to say, how long is this party going to last anyway? And I framed it as a party. I said, because when a party starts, people generally all arrive together, but they don't depart together. And you should be able to note when people are starting to head towards the door. Yeah. And I think that we failed in the stories that we were telling, in the analytics that we were doing, in the diagnostics that we were doing, to try to give those early indicators of when the party was starting to end. Because if we had done a good job on that, these companies would not have overhired the way that they did. They wouldn't have made these massive investments thinking that the party was going to last forever. So what I would say, the lessons learned out of the last couple of years, and God forbid we have to go through another event like we did, but keep your eye on some of those leading indicators.
Yep.
Really pay attention to them. Look for symptoms before you get a full-blown disease. And we failed to do that on a massive scale, and we're failing to do it again by letting go as the number of people that we're letting go now. We expected the party to rage forever, and we're expecting it to never happen again. So that this huge pendulum shift that I'm starting to see, it's alarming and concerning, because I know a year from now we're going to be talking about the labor shortage and the inability to attract and retain and recruit the right salespeople, and the fact that we lost some of the most talented sellers because they got buried in the mess with everyone else that got let go. It's our responsibility in revenue operations to try to prevent that from happening again. We should learn from this.
And when you talk about that, so I'm going to piggyback here, right? What does that look like? Is that, a conversation, right? And really having kind of that crucial conversation of like, what should we be looking at? What are these hypotheses? What are the external versus the internal kind of variables that we should be benchmarking or monitoring to help us define these, leading indicators that we might not have had defined before?
I think, Molly, we have to be really good storytellers. And we can't just put the analytics up there and expect it to be interpreted by the audience that's seeing it. We need, when I started telling the story about the party, that's when people started to get it, because everybody has been to a college rager, and they've observed it themselves, where there was a mood that changed in the room, but there were still a lot of people there, but they weren't exactly sure what had happened. It's because a a couple of the most important people had left. And I think whatever analogies we can find to help people understand what our hypothesis
Yep.
is really important.
Yeah, go ahead, Molly.
No, and then just thinking about, how you run those scenarios, right? Based on probably lack of data or lack of full information, and having some sort of confidence interval, at least, as, again, this isn't the smoking gun that's going to give you the full answer. It's like the indicator that you should start monitoring closer
Yeah.
and start making some decisions.
Janine Lacey, I like how you framed it. You can't assume people know what we're talking about without telling a relatable story. We have to be master storytellers. And I can tell just by speaking to a group of sales operations, revenue operations people, our wheels are always turning. Like as soon as somebody starts talking about wanting to change the compensation plan next year, we start to think of the million different variables that need to be connected to one another in order to make that a reality. And a lot of times a company will start talking about introducing performance measures into a compensation plan that can't be measured. And but they're hell bent on doing that. And that's why your compensation plan gets delivered 9 months late. And you had no compensation plan for 9 months because you had this need to want to measure something that couldn't be measured. So it's us. We need to be the sane individuals in the room that try to prevent those things from happening.
I think this goes back to the operational piece, right? If you don't have that operational foundation and data that you're gathering, then how do you inform the future, right? And I feel like, Molly, I want to ask you this question, and you asked Dana this, is essentially, as a RevOps leader, what should we be measuring from a growth perspective to, scale so that we can calculate our actions?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on the business, right? Like, you've got to have the foundational, you've got to have kind of the journey. I think about, the 5 core metrics of, volume, velocity, conversion rate, aging, and activity, right? And getting those really honed in, and as those are what are driving to any sort of like output from a revenue perspective. And then when you go into the diagnostics, right, it's then how do you compare and contrast and understand, what is campaign A doing versus campaign B doing, and why is that performing a different result, and figuring out the levers that you can pull or the adjustments you can make based on the comparison information. You see this a lot with, like, how come rep A and rep B are doing so differently? Well, what's different in their process? What's different in their approach? What's different in their methodology? And making the determination of, like, does this champion challenger and rescale? Or is this, nuance? But having the ability to do those comparisons in a way that you can support with data, but also by looking at the process.
Molly, you just rattled those milestones off so quickly. Like because they're ingrained in your operating model, and you could turn that into a framework and sell it to Gartner and make $1 million. So what were those?
Call me, because I've got it all in a framework right now.
I told you it's all in our heads. Yeah. So
volume, velocity, conversion, aging, and then activity.
Slack me.
Yeah, I can send you these. So the things that I think about, a lot in, like, our framework, specifically at Deal, right person, right time, right touch, right metric. And if you can have that aligned, right, like, you're doing something well there.
I think that's a great point, right? And maybe that's why, Dana, to your point earlier, is, if you just look back maybe 72 months, were we moving too fast as an industry that we forgot the operational pieces of data? Or, were we moving so fast at a growth stage that we were just like, let's go to market and worry about the operational data later, that we're now seeing these kind of impacts on not just revenue, but also on the employee and workforce?
Yeah, so because there was an air of fear, not just because of the pandemic, but also because of people thinking that they were going to miss out on an opportunity to do something. And they called it the Great Resignation. It wasn't the Great Resignation; it was a great rearranging of chairs.
Yeah.
These companies weren't these people weren't resigning; they were going to different opportunities based upon who was hiring and who was offering more money.
And because you weren't landlocked anymore, right? I think that was like such a big thing where people generally for so long were just looking in their circle, right? Their bubble, and then their bubble became global in a lot of situations.
We have a question from Roy on LinkedIn, and he's asking, is there a format to use metrics? For example, operational metrics weekly, performance metrics monthly. What does that look like?
I think it depends. I'm the tagline for RevOps, right? RevOps. It depends. It depends on the business. It depends on the audience as well, right? And then ultimately you're reviewing metrics, but you're not just reviewing metrics to review metrics, right? You're reviewing metrics to make a decision, to make a change, to understand and interpret. So while you look at these things, right, there's daily dashboards you should look at, right, daily things you should look at, but they might not tell the same story if you look at it on a monthly or quarterly basis. So I think it depends on how are you looking at this. Are you looking at it from a pacing standpoint? So if I'm trying to evaluate my SDR performance and seeing how they're doing and generating sales qualified opportunities, like looking at this every morning and looking at a number is arbitrary unless I overlay it based on pacing. How does this compare week over week, month over month, quarter over quarter? Am I ahead or am I behind? That drives more of the decision piece. So it's not just looking at the metric, it's the narrative of how you're interpreting the metric based on the business decision and the business outcome you're hoping to change.
I like the pacing element to it because it makes things, it puts things in context, right? So
Yep.
if you're not making your number for the quarter, the first thing you ask is if you're growing or if you're not growing. So
Yep.
if you're not making your number and you're not growing, then that's really bad. But if you're not making your number and you're growing, that's not quite as bad.
Yep.
But I typically start with a sales. I always call it a sales flash report. I'm probably dating myself, but it was what's your target? What have you booked? How much do you have left to go? And then I like to look at the pipeline very simply in descending order from stage 5 all the way down to stage 0, and look at the amount that I have in each one of those stages and maybe do a cross cut based upon forecast category. Because if I've got 10 million left to go and it's the last day of the quarter and I've got $4 million in stage 3, that's not good. So I like to look at it relative to that. So bookings, target bookings to go, pipeline in consideration to that. And then Molly, backing it up even a little bit further with activity.
Yep.
So if I don't have the pipeline, do I have enough activity? Backing it up as far as I could. And I think we would have avoided some of these problems that we're experiencing now if we would have gone to, all right, we're seeing a slowdown in bookings. That's a problem. Maybe we should be making some adjustments. And maybe before we saw the slowdown in bookings, we saw a slowdown in pipeline creation. And maybe we saw a slowdown in pipeline acceleration, that size, shape, velocity that you were talking about, Molly. There were lots of things that happened before we started missing our bookings numbers and caused us problems that we have now.
Yeah, I think that brings a great point, right? And it's a great segue into our next question. It's one thing to have all those insights, but the question, and Molly and I have debated about this, is do you trust your data, right? Is it accurate? And so in our research, we also found that trust in data accuracy was actually 20% higher in orgs with RevOps. And so I would love your thoughts, Dana and Molly. And I feel like we've been talking about this, and perhaps it's that operational piece is, from your experience, how do RevOps teams generally work to ensure this kind of sentiment across functions?
They want to tell the story of lead to renewal, for one thing. So they're fixing the underlying problems that are preventing them from being able to tell that story. Mm-hmm. Where if you just have a sales operations organization, they're interested in telling the story of marketing. I'm sorry, of bookings, and maybe telling some stories to make marketing look bad. Yeah, in the old world, right, where they were throwing stones at each other constantly. So there's commonality of purpose and vision.
Yeah, I think so too. Like even for myself, who have been in marketing roles, I always imagine that a RevOps person would be that objective eye that is able to take a 60,000 foot view and gather all that data so that they can tell that story of, okay, well, this is where the drop off is. And what do we need to do here to then, to your point, diagnose and have those activities to nurture it over into closed won. And so to your point, if I only have sales ops and marketing ops and we're working in silos and there aren't alignment, then at the same time, I feel like as a stakeholder, are we talking the same language? And if we're not, how do we get there?
I mean, it's the whole like conversation we had, back when I was at Marketo of like, marketing contributing to revenue, right? It goes back to aligning people around a common goal, right? And I think that becomes our piece, right? If marketing is getting compensated on MQOs or MQLs and sales is getting compensated on revenue, right? You're not aligning against the customer experience, the customer journey, and driving the same outcomes. You're incentivizing different behavior that isn't advantageous to like what you're trying to do as a business. And I think that's, becomes the value of like revenue operations. You take these functions and you're aligning them against the customer experience, right? And how to operationalize revenue and grow the business in a way that delights consumers, creates a better seller framework, and work together. And I think that's so important on this, and that's where you start to get that alignment. Back to your point, Elise, of like I get frustrated when I hear people say they don't trust the data, right? Because like ultimately what that means is like you don't have the right process then. Like data is black and white, right? If you say, well, it's not really 5, well, it is 5, right? 5 is the outcome that came from the data because of what we told it to measure. So if you're running into issues with data accuracy, data components, like you've got to go back and actually say, do I have authority? Do I have governance? Do I have definition? And does that support the right process, right? So understanding the process is, I think, a lot of the places that I especially see when I'm working at more of like C-level, where they're questioning the data, but they don't actually understand the process and don't understand the customer experience and like how that gets generated to interpret why this is the output of the data.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because double the number of our respondents agree that they're more confident in the data if RevOps was present in the organization versus without. Right. And so you're a RevOps leader. So if I had you on my team, I probably feel more confident that you've already worked on all the processes and the systems and connecting them and providing essentially that connection between all the systems so that all that data is coming together. But if I don't have you as a resource, I'm probably looking at my system thinking, gosh, how do I connect HubSpot to Salesforce to Loqua? Like, what is happening here? And I just need this data to get to my executive team so I can present it, right? Dana, I would love your thoughts on this too, in terms of how you've seen teams, from your experience, work together to ensure essentially that they have more accuracy across their data.
Well, I mentioned that I was leading a revenue operations team that was the coalition of the willing, with all these different analytics resources buried in all these different places. And it was my responsibility to gather the executives in each of these different functions. So it was customer success, it was marketing, it was sales, and say, we all have a need here. There's something that we would like to see commonly among our groups. What is that? So when we could agree on what we wanted to see, then we harnessed the power of those 16 individuals to gather the information that was required and to put it in place by a certain date. And that's what happened. Some of this is in sales and revenue operations. We talk a lot about people, process, and technology, but I think we should be talking about spirit and will of the individuals that need to make some of this stuff happen. I'll give you an example. I'm on today will be day 500 in a row where I've run 6 to 10 miles a day without missing a day. And that means outdoors in the snow, in the rain. It means running at 3:00 in the morning when I'm in San Francisco so I can catch a flight at 8 a.m. I committed to the outcome, and then I figured out how to make it happen after. And something in my brain shifted where I just wouldn't take no for an answer. And I think if we do the same thing with analytics, like as a sales revenue operations leader, if you commit to the idea that you're going to tell compelling stories in a very succinct way, and it's going to be actionable, and you're going to make a difference to the organization, if you can do that, and then you can find a couple of individuals who are willing to do that with you, all these underlying problems you're going to figure out how to solve yourself. Right? So you're going to figure out how to bridge that gap between HubSpot and Salesforce and SAP, whatever systems you need to gather. You're going to find the solution to that problem.
You're building a plan and you're working the plan, right?
Yeah.
So you set your outcome and you're reverse engineering how you get there, right? And at the end of the day, those are obstacles that then you're working through to get you to the outcome, that you need to get to?
Molly, I think I heard it might have been Simon Sinek or someone like that, where they said your brain doesn't really understand what better means. If you just say you're going to be better at something, there's no benchmark for what that means when you do get better. But if you say you're going to be the best at something, it understands what your best is. And I think if you can be the best at telling stories inside of the organization, you're going to go out there and find the resources that you need to do this. And I mean, it's kind of kumbaya, right? But you will have that resolve and that drive, and you will not take no for an answer. And if you're in a company that's not allowing you to do that, you're going to get frustrated, and you're going to go someplace where you can do that, because there's many companies out there who are frustrated and they want to solve this problem now.
100%. I think this goes back to creating that alignment and starting with the glossary and data dictionary of understanding what is it how is it defined, and what is it that we're measuring? Quickly, Molly, just for our audience again, what was your framework? Volume, velocity, conversion, aging, and what else?
Activity.
Perfect. And then
I can post something on LinkedIn outlining all of this too.
Let's do that. And then we have a question from Janine Lacey. She asked, what were some of the strategies you used to align data with demand gen data coming in to tell the top of funnel story for conversions to new qualified ops?
It's a big question. I might have to read that one again.
I mean, it's also along the lines of how can you measure marketing's contribution to the pipeline? Is that the summarize?
Yeah. And that goes back to, again, like the standardization of process and the normalization and having that definition, right? So like, what is your attribution framework that you're looking at when you're looking at source first influence? And how do you make sure, the big thing that I think a lot about with the marketing side of things is like the right governance around this, because it's not always a fluid process of something comes in, converts, without any, sales interaction. There's always sales interaction in this, unless you're, fully running a different model. But what is the governance of how you capture this and how you attribute things back, and making sure you have that clear architectural process throughout this motion. And I think that's where a lot of people go rogue. Even simple things like we don't let lead source get overridden, right? Like that's such a basic thing, but like the impact that has in telling the story and the narrative is so important.
Yeah, and I'll get a little tactical too, where I've seen more and more companies that they have a lot less trust in the lead object inside of Salesforce now, because that's kind of an antiquated model where you had a lead that converted to a contact, that converted to an account, that converted to an opportunity. That's not how companies buy, and it's no one person is going to make the decision on most of these enterprise purchases. There's a buying group that's out there. So you see more and more companies will start with a sales stage 0, which they always told you not to do because it was a meaningless opportunity. But when you have an opportunity object, you're now able to attribute multiple contacts to that, and you can get a truer picture of what's going on. To give you an example, if you've got, let's say you're looking at an analytics solution and you get the head of revenue operations on the hook, and they're having a conversation with you. Well, you think that's great because that's the person that's ultimately going to buy. But if you invite that person to a meeting and suddenly the head of procurement pops in, now that's a committee purchase, and you're gonna have to convince that procurement person. So it's not singular any longer. So you have to be able to look at things multidimensionally like that and think in terms of buying groups and centers instead of individuals. And one tactical way to do it is at stage 0.
Yep.
I think we're seeing more and more of that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and like the pushback's always like falsifying pipeline, but right, it doesn't have to falsify pipeline when done properly. And the other piece of this is like if it never hits that opportunity, when you think about why it didn't move forward, you're not capturing that in a centralized place either. You're then capturing it on said lead or said contact and at the person level versus at the business level.
Molly, I don't know if you've seen it, but over my career, I've seen the evolution of marketing. They've become a lot more analytics focused. They measure and track everything. They've outpaced the sales organization. Oftentimes, they're beating sales up because they're not operating with the same level of execution. But I've become a marketing fan in the last 5 years, especially, where now that we're able to measure their influence and their impact. So in revenue operations, I think a lot of us come from sales operations, and it's a skill that we need to develop in ourselves, and we need to build up that capability to do a better job of supporting the marketing organization, helping them get better analytics.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's bridging the gap, right? Because I think, still, marketing, when marketing's looking at their advanced data sets, right, they're getting to opportunity, they're getting there, they're, validating their CAC and those pieces, but like a lot of times it doesn't then align to the sales process. And so building that relational thing, and I still, I laugh because like it's like we've been talking about this for 10 years about like marketing and sales friction, but again, like until you can align it against the experience, the journey, the outcome as an organization, like the budget, the process, the like how we work together isn't going to come together.
Yeah. And I think that takes us right into our next question, right? Is we know that essentially with or without RevOps, executives and ops professionals don't agree on the health of their organizational data. So Molly, this one I'm going to punt it to you is essentially in companies without RevOps, just 18% of RevOps professionals there are confident that their customer data matches from system to system, while 36% say the same. But interestingly, I would say that according to our research, only 27% of ops pros agree that half of executives are confident in their data matches. And so the question for you both is this idea of organizational data. We've been talking about this for the past 45 minutes. If everyone is from leaders to individual contributors, ops pros are not agreeing on this data set or the accuracy of it, what is happening?
I mean, it's the same thing we've been talking about this whole time, right? It's the alignment, it's the definition, it's the, back when I was at a former company, we literally sat and wrote the definitions out, had our data dictionary, and they were signed off on by the CEO and the C-level of like, this is what this means. And it not only was, this is what this means from a business definition, this is where the source data comes from. And this is how the source data is generated, right? So when we talk about a customer, in that case, monthly active user, like this is the definition. And it's, I mean, I hate to say it, and maybe I'm a little like, it's hyped up, but it's, I mean, yeah, this is me hyped up, but like, it's almost a cop out and an excuse at this point, right? Like if you're not confident in your data and you're an executive, then like, that's crap on you, right? Like you should have that confidence and you should have that ownership at that level. Like don't scapegoat your data, fix it. And by fix it, I mean define it and align it.
I love that.
I think Molly, I mean, it's part of that though. We need to be able to explain to those executives that we're asking to make investments in solving these problems, what the problem is, what we need to solve it, and how much money we're going to need, and when they can see an impact. That's the hard part. We need to be salespeople.
And we need the time and space to do it, right? So like if you want it fixed, it's not, there's little incremental things you can do, but if you can actually get the right working group, get the right plan, get the right focus on something, like you're going to get the output sooner. So, with any conversation I have on prioritization, how important is it to you?
Yeah. You know what? It's interesting you say that because a lot of RevOps pros that I talk to, they're so busy putting out fires, right, that they don't have that time and space to start thinking beyond what they need to do tactically. And so when you think about that same vein, sometimes data accuracy is put on the back burner, right? Because they have to go figure out where all these opportunities came from because maybe they didn't have the processes in place or maybe they inherited a new stack. And so when you think about that same vein, what is your best advice for folks who are continuously putting out fires? How can they find that time and space, take a step back and say, wait a minute, let's define and align first. How can they get that buy-in from their stakeholders and their executives?
I mean, it comes down to prioritization, right? And so like, I think as RevOps people, when we're doing our planning, when we're doing our road mapping, when we're setting our expectations, like there's never going to be a world without fires, right? And there's never going to be, ad hoc requests, but like having a really strong mechanism of how you prioritize those and feeling empowered to prioritize those, I think is really important. I try to leave about 30% of my bandwidth of my team into like an ad hoc piece, but then we also like, we quadrant them, right? Like what's due now, what's due later, what's due never, what's due next, and make sure we're tiering those, right? Because if everything's urgent, nothing is urgent. So making sure like we have really clear prioritization of what becomes a fire. And then on the flip side is the empowerment to push back, right? If I'm getting asked to do something, like we need to have a clear plan that we're working, that we can force trade-offs. And a lot of times it's not me saying like, pick what you want me to do. It's me giving a recommendation based on what I believe the business value is and the importance to the business, right? So if you've asked me to get these metrics cleared up, but now you're coming in and saying you want to figure out, you know, why a churn reason is off. I don't know. I'm just throwing something out there. Like I want to be able to influence your decision making on why I don't think that's as important and why that can wait. And I think feeling empowered to have those conversations. The other thing is that I think we necessarily don't always do well in RevOps is like setting those right timelines, setting the right deadlines, and like really scoping and communicating what goes into something. Because something might seem very simple, but as we all know, this is an onion and we peel back layers. And so being able to articulate the scope and like the impact and the time that something needs to happen in a way that like makes sense to a C-level, right, is also really important. So they understand what's the input and what's the output. So the input of the time, but the output of to the value.
Great. And as a part of that, what would be some key words to inspire data confidence with these executives? Or what have you used that has worked in the past, Molly?
I mean, I don't know what the key word for data confidence is. I think I laugh, right? Because I think sometimes when people talk about confidence in the data, it's that they don't like seeing what they're seeing. Mm-hmm. And again, it goes back to the definition, right? If I'm a CSO and I see something drop by 20%, like my first reaction tends to be, is this right? Right? Like, is this right? I don't believe the data because I don't think this is correct, right? And so I think when you're looking at the confidence in the data, and this goes back to Dana's point of being the storyteller, right? Instead of us just putting the number on the board, being able to say like, you know, here's diagnostically what impact this, like what has happened to this, why are we seeing what we're seeing, how does this compare, you know, quarter over quarter, year over year, to get to the root versus it just being a lack of confidence in the output.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I remember Molly, like 10 years ago, when predictive analytics was just starting to become a thing before AI, I wrote a blog. It was called Predictive Analytics, Can You Handle the Truth? So what happens when the sales rep is not the person responsible for rolling up the forecast any longer, but the machine is, and the machine's got a 99% accuracy. I've been through so many forecast calls where the rep is trying to roll up the truth and their manager's coming back to them and say, you better sharpen your pencil and come back and fix this. And some of it's because it works. You know, some of that applied pressure will get people to act with a little bit more urgency or do things that they wouldn't have done. But sometimes they just don't want the truth, or they can't handle the truth because the truth is just too ugly. And it requires a change in mindset aside of organizations when you start presenting them with accurate information that's telling the truth. What do you do then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that for me, when I look at that data, I'm like, it's eye-opening, right? Again, if I feel it's confident, which generally I would, if there's a RevOps pro in my organization and I see that, to me, I immediately go to think, okay, these are all the activities we need to do because of all of these gaps or so, right? Opportunities to create touch points, opportunities to convert. That's how I kind of look at it.
Yeah. The whole question of, you know, tactical versus strategic, because every operations person wants to be able to operate in a more strategic way. They want to be able to influence the top line growth and what's going to happen in the future, but they get prevented from doing that because they get stuck in the tactical activities of trying to find information and put out fires, as Molly mentioned. Molly, you brought up planning. I think planning is a big piece of it because you spend 6 months out of the fiscal year planning, and when you're not planning, you're thinking about planning or you're revising the plan. So plan, and that takes up 40 to 50% of the capacity of the team.
Yep.
So,
versus working the plan, right? So it's
right.
Like, I use the goalpost analogy a lot, even though I don't know that goalposts ever actually move in football. But moving the goalposts. Every time you make those shifts, like you're detrimentally impacting like productivity. So I have to be really mindful of that on my team, is like if I'm taking them away from something they're getting, they're 60% of the way through, to refocus them on something else. Like what's the value in that of like context switching and having to start over too? Because then when they get back to that 60%, they're probably going back to 30% because they have to go back and re-educate, realign, like get themselves up to speed before they can move things through. So being really mindful of like how much you're lifting and shifting, especially at the executionary level for your team, because that ultimately prevents the productivity of output.
Agreed. We have a question from Landon on LinkedIn. He asks, to what extent do requests for reports on data dashboards from C-levels and sales leaders consume your bandwidth?
I'll say, like, if you've done a good job of creating the operational reports, that should consume 0% of your bandwidth. It's when they start to ask the diagnostics, then that's what's going to start to consume your bandwidth. And if they're asking for the same diagnostic information every single day, every single minute, every single hour, that means that should be in an operational report. So I know we're getting close to time here. So I mean, some to-dos that I would recommend is, Molly, I love what you said, is creating that data dictionary. Start off with a data dictionary, agree on terminology across the organization. That's everything from a marketing qualified lead to a region in an area.
Yep.
And have those conversations across these organizations so that you can all look at things. And then design your optimum operational report by audience. So from the executive to the sales executive to the manager to the salesperson. And if you do that, you've made significant progress. And then the third thing I would say is think about how much you guys are planning and how much of your time goes into that, and think about how you could do that a lot more efficiently than the way that you do it. My personal favorite is to create a head of strategy planning and rewards. And that's all that team and that organization thinks about, because it's different than the operational diagnostics piece of it, the analytics piece of it. I think a mistake that we make is that we have the same people doing analytics, doing planning, because they can't do the same. They can't do it all at once.
No, so, and you can't take that focus to really do planning the right way.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I was just thinking about that too, right? If you already start with your data dictionary and you've already designed your reports and your dashboards and automating and moving that data, then going back to create those reports for the executives shouldn't take you a lot of time, because it's already coming through in near real time, right?
Well, and you have that foundation in your operational report, so that when you do move to, the diagnostic, right, you're essentially adding a layer onto it, and you're adding, I mean, in my mind, it's adding layering to a foundational piece that you're then slicing and dicing kind of off of this baseline. And so if you don't have your baselines right and you don't have your baselines consistent, then your diagnostics then become ad hoc, which is not what you want to have happen. You want them to be building upon your operational.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, we are at that 2-minute mark. Everyone, we have dropped in the resources section, essentially our full names. Follow us on LinkedIn. If you copy the bottom full name and paste that into your LinkedIn URL, you can certainly follow Dana, Molly, and myself. For any more details, feel free to reach out to us. This has been incredible. We have about 1 minute left. I just wanted to let everybody know, in conjunction to our report from Synchrony here, we are launching essentially a what does life look like without RevOps? So this campaign, Molly laughs, is essentially what does life look like without?
What does this do with for my job security here?
This is submit a 30-second video to me on LinkedIn and or my email, elise@synchrony.com. We are going full force tomorrow, but you guys heard it here first. 30-second video on what does life look like without RevOps. And this is everything we've been talking about in the last hour. What does life look like without RevOps? Let us know. Winner wins $400 Airbnb or Amazon gift card. Second place gets $200. First place gets $100. Most voted as well. And we'll share those as they come out. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day and talk soon.
Thanks, Elise.
Take care.
Thanks
for having us. Bye.